stand on the plain of Manzikert at dawn. The grass runs flat to the hills, and somewhere beyond them is an enemy your scouts swear is 400 miles away. You are Romanos, Emperor of the Romans, and you have brought the largest army in a generation here to win back a frontier that is slipping from your hands. By dusk, that army will be gone, and you will be a prisoner, kneeling before the man you came to destroy. This is the story of a single afternoon in the late summer of 1071, in which an empire lost not just a battle, but the heartland it had held for 1,000 years. How do you lose a world in an afternoon? To understand the disaster, begin with an empire already tired. A century before, under Basil II, Byzantium had been the strongest power in the Christian world. But the great emperor left no heir, and the decades that followed were ruled by weak hands and a jealous court. The provincial armies, the themata, were starved of money and left to decay, and the realm's defense was handed more and more to hired foreign swords. On the eastern frontier the results were plain. In 1064, the Armenian capital of Ani was lost, and Turkish raiders sacked the great city of Caesarea in 1067. Then, in 1068, a soldier stepped into the drift. The general Romanos Diogenes married the widowed empress Eudokia, took the throne, and swore to ride east and restore what had been lost. His enemy was a power still rising. Out of the steppes of Central Asia had come the Seljuk Turks, and under Tugrul Beg they built an empire at astonishing speed. They broke their rivals at Dandanakan in 1040, and in 1055 entered Baghdad itself, where the Seljuk Sultan became the sword and protector of the Abbasid Caliph. In 1063, Tugril was succeeded by his nephew Alp Arslan, the heroic lion, served by one of the great statesmen of the age, the vizier Nizam al-Mulk. The Sultan's eyes were on the rich lands of Fatimid Syria to the south, but his restless Turkmen tribesmen drifted ever westward into Armenia and the Byzantine marches. Two expanding empires were reaching for the same mountains, and a collision was only a matter of time. The two hosts that met at Manzikert could hardly have been less alike. The army of Romanos was vast and a patchwork, perhaps 40,000 strong, though the figures are disputed. It gathered the regular tagmata and provincial themata, the axe-bearing Varangian guard about the emperor, Norman and Frankish knights under the mercenary Roussel de Bayeux, Armenian infantry, and Pechenegue and Uz horse archers of doubtful loyalty. Romanos held the centre, Bryennios the left, Alyattes the right, and the crucial reserve fell to Andronikos Doukas, son of the emperor's bitterest rival. Against them stood the Sultan's army, smaller, its numbers also disputed, but fast and singular in purpose, built around masses of Turkmen horse archers and a hard core of disciplined Gulam household cavalry, all bent to a single will, the will of Alp Arslan. To reach his enemy, Romanos first had to cross his own crumbling empire. Through the summer, the great column wound east, from Constantinople through Caesarea and Sebastea, reaching the frontier fortress of Theodosiopolis in June. Feeding a host this size in hostile country was a daily ordeal, and discipline frayed. At a war council, Bryennios and other cautious heads urged the emperor to halt, to wait on the frontier and let the Sultan come to him. Romanos would not wait. He was certain Alp Arslan was far to the south, locked in his own war near Aleppo, and that the road to a swift and glorious victory lay open. So the army marched on, deeper into the mountains, down toward Lake Van, and a battle its commander was sure he could not lose. In the last days of August, the army came down to Manzikert, and there Romanos made his fatal choice. Still convinced the Sultan was absent, he split his force in two. Half of it, under Joseph Tarkaniotes, with the Franks, the Varangians and the Pechenegs, was sent south toward the fortress of Kliat, on the northwestern shore of Lake Van. With the other half, the emperor took Manzikert town almost without a fight. And then, the Kliat wing simply vanishes from the record. Whether scattered or fled at the first sight of the enemy, it never returned. Days later, its men surfaced far to the west, at Melitene. When the great battle came, Romanos would fight it with barely half the army he had led from Constantinople. For the Sultan was not in Syria. Alp Arslan had abandoned his southern campaign and force-marched north faster than the Byzantines believed any army could move, and he was here, on the plain, in full strength. The signs were misread one by one. Scouting parties under Bryennios met Turks in alarming numbers and were thrown back, their warnings waved away as nerves. A cavalry detachment under Nikephoros Basileikes rode out against what was taken for a raiding band, and was swallowed whole, its commander dragged from his horse and captured. Only now, far too late, did the truth settle over the Byzantine camp. The enemy they had come so far to find, and could not, stood in front of them, with his whole army at his back. Alp Arslan had not sought this battle, and even now he tried to turn it aside. He sent an embassy offering a truce. Romanos, with the larger army and an empire's prestige at stake, refused and sent the envoys away. The Sultan answered in another language. By tradition, he dressed in white, the color of a burial shroud, perfumed himself with musk, and told his men that if he fell here, this was where he wished to lie, then made ready to fight as one who has made his peace with death. And in the night his quieter war bore fruit. The Uz and Pecheneg horse archers in Byzantine pay, kinsmen of the Turks across the line, slipped away in the dark and went over to the Sultan, stripping Romanos of the very horsemen he would need most. At dawn on the 26th of August, the armies drew up on the open plain. The Byzantine line was deep and broad. Romanos in the center, beneath the imperial standards, Bryennios on the left, Aliates on the right, and behind them all Andronikos Doukas, holding the reserve meant to guard the army's back. But across the grass there was no line to face them. The Seljuk host was arrayed as a great crescent, a halal, its horns curving forward, its center hollow and inviting. Light horse archers swarmed the wings. The heavy Gulam cavalry waited, hidden in the folds of the hills. It was a formation made for one kind of war alone, the fluid, encircling war of the steppe, and exactly the war the Byzantines were least prepared to fight. What followed was not a clash, but a slow unwinding. The Sultan's wings rode forward, loosed their arrows, and fell back. The Byzantine line advanced to grip them, and the Turks melted away, only to wheel and strike again at the flanks. Hour after hour, through the long afternoon, the deep Byzantine block was drawn forward across the plain, stretching longer and thinner, while arrows bled its edges, and it could never close with an enemy that dissolved and reformed at will. Romanos took the empty Seljuk camp and found nothing there to hold. And all the while, the horns of the Crescent curled inward, around the overextended army, closing with the unhurried certainty of a falcon folding its wings to strike. The Byzantines were not so much being beaten as surrounded, worn down, and made ready for the kill. As the light began to fail, Romanos faced a hard truth. He had gripped nothing, and the day was slipping away. He gave the order to break off, and the imperial standards were turned about as the signal to withdraw. And here the army's deepest wound opened. The reversed standards were read all down the line as a different message entirely. That the emperor was down, the center lost. Order dissolved into rumor. And the rear under Andronikos Doukas, a man of the faction that hated Romanos, did not turn to cover the withdrawal. It marched off the field, leaving the center uncovered and alone. Whether this was treachery, or panic, or only a fatally ambiguous order misread in the dusk, historians have argued ever since. What is not in doubt is the result. Alp Arslan saw the gap, and into it he loosed the cavalry he had held back all day. The Gulam household charged the broken center, and the Crescent closed at last. The Byzantine heart was surrounded. Around the emperor, the Varangian guard fought and died to the last man, their long axes rising and falling, until none were left to lift them. Romanos fought on. His horse was killed under him, He was wounded in the hand, and at the end he stood on foot amid the wreck of his army, until he was overwhelmed and taken alive. For the first time in centuries, a Roman emperor was a prisoner of war held by the Sultan he had marched 1,500 miles to destroy. What happened next belongs as much to legend as to history, but the sources agree on its spirit. The captured emperor in torn and dusty clothes was brought before Alp Arslan. The Sultan, it is said, asked what he would have done had their places been reversed. Romanos answered honestly that he would have had him killed, and Alp Arslan chose mercy. The terms were generous: a ransom, an annual tribute, an exchange of prisoners, and a marriage alliance between their houses. The emperor was treated with honor, and within about a week he was released and sent home under escort. On the field itself, the dead were far fewer than the scale of the catastrophe suggests. The true ruin of Manzikert would be worked not by the Sultan, but by Romanos' own people. The numbers, like all the numbers of this day, are disputed and should be read with care. Modern scholars believe the Byzantine dead in the battle itself were relatively few, commonly put near 8,000, and that much of the great army survived, once the deserters and the lost Kliat wing are counted. Manzikert was a political earthquake far more than a slaughter. For Romanos came home not to gratitude, but to a coup. The Doukas faction tore up his treaty, declared him deposed, and when at last he fell into their hands, they had him blinded. He died of the wounds in 1072. The empire then collapsed into 10 years of civil war, and with no field army left to bar the way, the Turkmen bands rode into Anatolia almost as they pleased. In the end, it was not the battle that changed the world, but the ruin that came after it. While Byzantium tore itself apart, the Turks came to stay. Within a decade, a new state had risen on once Roman soil, the Sultanate of Rum, founded by Suleiman, a kinsman of the Sultan, with its capital at Nicaea, almost within sight of Constantinople across the water. The slow remaking of Anatolia had begun, the land that would one day be called Turkey. A frightened empire turned at last to the Christian West and begged for aid, and that plea would help set in motion the First Crusade. Manzikert cost few lives for a battle, but it opened a door that would never again be shut. An empire lost a frontier in an afternoon, and a continent began, slowly, to change its name.